Jack Morrison had been scrubbing the toilets at Oakmont Country Club for 3 years, when the woman in the cashier coat called him a loser in front of 50 people. He didn't fight back. He couldn't. His 7-year-old daughter, Emma, was sitting in the waiting room of St. Jude's Hospital, hooked up to a heart monitor that beeped every time she breathed too fast. That morning, Jack had received a bill for $42,000. That afternoon, Veronica Ashby Hughes dropped her diamond earring into the toilet he had just cleaned and demanded he fish it out with his bare hands. He did it. He smiled. And then the real story began. 3 years earlier, Jack Morrison had been a different man. He had owned a small but respected construction company in Austin, Texas. He had a wife named Sarah who sang off-key in the shower, and a daughter who drew galaxies on every available surface. They lived in a modest house with a blue front door and a pecan tree in the backyard. Then Sarah got sick. It was fast, the way a summer storm rolls off the plains and turns the sky green before you can close the windows. Pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the morning Jack woke up holding a hand that had gone cold. He sold the company to pay the medical bills. He sold the house to pay for Emma's first heart surgery, because the doctors had discovered a congenital defect during Sarah's final week, as if the universe wanted to make sure Jack had nothing left to hold onto. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a garage on the south side of town. He took the first job that would work around Emma's hospital schedule. Night custodian at Oakmont Country Club. The members never saw him. That was the rule. Jack was supposed to work from midnight to 6 in the morning, scrubbing the locker rooms, the dining hall, the private lounges where the oak-paneled walls cost more than his truck. But 2 months before the earring incident, the club manager had changed Jack's shift to afternoons because a new catering director complained about the smell of bleach during lunch service. So now Jack pushed his mop past the same tables where men in seersucker suits ordered $100 bottles of wine, and women with designer bags discussed their next trips to Paris. He was invisible until someone needed something. That was the other rule. Veronica Ashby Hughes had been a member of Oakmont for 12 years. She was the widow of a tech billionaire who had left her a portfolio of real estate, a condo in Manhattan, and a permanent sense of entitlement that could be felt from across the room. She chaired the club's social committee. She had her own parking spot near the main entrance, and the staff had learned to say yes before she finished asking. On the afternoon of the earring, Veronica was hosting a luncheon for the Oakmont Women's Auxiliary, a group of 40 women who met once a month to discuss charity while eating salmon and judging everyone who wasn't in the room. Jack had been assigned to clean the powder room adjacent to the main dining hall. It was a job he had done 100 times. He pushed his cart through the service corridor, knocked twice on the door to make sure it was empty, and went to work. He was on his knees scrubbing the base of the third stall when he heard the main door swing open. He looked up. Veronica Ashby Hughes stood over him, her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand holding a diamond earring that had come loose from her lobe. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't say excuse me. She finished her call, dropped the earring into the toilet bowl by accident or by intention, and then looked down at Jack as if he were a piece of furniture that had learned to breathe. "You," she said. "Get it out." Jack looked at the earring, a half-carat diamond floating in the clean water of the toilet he had just disinfected. He looked at Veronica's face, which was arranged in an expression of mild disgust, as if she had stepped in something soft. He thought about Emma. He thought about the $42,000 bill folded in his back pocket. He reached into the bowl and pulled out the earring. He rinsed it under the tap, dried it on a paper towel, and handed it back to her. She took it with 2 fingers, examined it, and walked out without a word. She did not say thank you. She did not say sorry. That night, Jack sat in the hospital waiting room while Emma slept in a bed behind a curtain. He had brought his dinner, a peanut butter sandwich and a bruised apple, and he ate it slowly while the vending machines hummed. A nurse named Delia came out and sat beside him. She had been Emma's primary nurse for 6 months. She knew Jack's story without having to ask. She knew he had stopped taking his blood pressure medication because he couldn't afford the copay. She knew he had sold his wedding ring to pay for Emma's last round of tests. She put a hand on his arm and told him that Emma's numbers had improved slightly. Then she asked if he had eaten. He lied and said yes. Delia didn't believe him, but she didn't push. She stood up and walked back to the nurse's station, and Jack put his head against the wall and closed his eyes. He didn't cry. He had stopped crying 6 months after Sarah died, when he realized tears didn't pay bills and didn't fix hearts. But something in his chest tightened the way it always did when he thought about the future. Emma needed a second surgery. The first had bought them time, but the clock was running out. The hospital had offered a payment plan, but even the minimum payment was more than Jack made in a month. He had applied for every assistance program he could find. He had sold everything that wasn't nailed down. He was down to the bare bones of his life, and the bones were starting to crack. The next morning, Jack dropped Emma at school and drove to the county records office. He didn't know why. He had an hour before his shift started, and he needed to be somewhere that didn't smell like bleach. He sat in his truck in the parking lot, staring at the courthouse steps, and then he walked inside on a whim that felt like desperation. He asked the clerk behind the counter if he could look up the property records for Oakmont Country Club. The clerk, a woman with reading glasses and a nameplate that said Eileen, raised her eyebrows, but didn't ask questions. She led him to a bank of microfilm readers in the back corner and left him there. Jack spent 45 minutes scrolling through deeds and transfers. The land had originally been a cattle ranch owned by a family named Morrison. His family. His great-grandfather had sold it in 1952 to a developer who built the golf course and the clubhouse. The sale price, adjusted for inflation, was laughably small. The terms of the sale included a clause that had been flagged in red ink by a clerk decades ago. The developer had agreed to pay the Morrison family a percentage of the club's annual revenue in perpetuity. That clause had never been enforced. Jack's father had been a mechanic who never mentioned any inheritance. His grandfather had been a truck driver who died bankrupt. But the clause was still there, written in the language of lawyers who had long since turned to dust. Jack copied the relevant pages on the ancient photocopier in the hallway and walked out into the Texas sun with his hands shaking. He didn't know what to do with the information. He was a janitor with a heartbroken daughter and a bank account that hovered just above zero. He couldn't afford a lawyer. He couldn't afford a consultation. But he had the document, and the document said that the club owed his family money. Not millions, probably, but enough to pay for Emma's surgery. Enough to stop the bleeding. He went to work that afternoon and scrubbed the floors of the same clubhouse that had been built on his ancestors' land, and he didn't say a word to anyone. He waited. He watched. And 3 days later, he saw Veronica Ashby Hughes walk into the club manager's office with a man in an expensive suit. Jack was mopping the hallway outside the manager's door when he heard Veronica's voice through the thin walls. She was talking about a land dispute. She was talking about a nuisance claim from some descendant of the original owners. She was laughing. Jack's hand tightened on the mop handle. He heard the manager say something about a quiet settlement, a small payment to make the problem go away. Veronica said no. She said, and Jack would remember these words for the rest of his life, let them sue. They don't have the money. They're nobodies. Jack finished mopping the hallway. He clocked out at 6, picked up Emma from the after-school program, and drove to the public library. Emma sat at a table in the children's section, drawing pictures of butterflies, while Jack used the library computer to search for pro bono legal services in Travis County. He found a clinic run by the University of Texas Law School. He filled out an application on the spot. He didn't have high hopes. He had learned not to have high hopes. But 3 days later, a third-year law student named Marcus Chen called him and said the clinic would take his case. Marcus was 24 years old, wore sneakers with his suits, and had a passion for property law that bordered on obsession. He told Jack that the clause in the 1952 deed was likely enforceable under Texas law, but only if Jack could prove that the club had failed to make any payments for more than 50 years. That part was easy. Jack had the records. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks drafting a demand letter. He sent it to the club's board of directors, certified mail, return receipt requested. The letter asked for an accounting of all club revenues since 1952 and payment of the Morrison family's share, plus interest. It was a polite bomb wrapped in legal paper. The club's response came 5 days later. A letter from a high-powered law firm in Dallas, denying any obligation and threatening to countersue for harassment. The letter was signed by a partner named Harrison Crane. Jack looked up Harrison Crane on the library computer. His hourly rate was $1,200. Jack's weekly take-home pay was $480. He called Marcus, who sounded less confident than he had a week earlier. Marcus said the clinic would continue to represent him, but the club's lawyers would try to drag the case out for years. They would file motions and counter-motions. They would bury Jack in paperwork. They would make him go to depositions he couldn't afford to travel to. They would wait for him to give up. That was the strategy. Wear him down. Bleed him dry. And Jack, with his sick daughter and his janitor's salary, was the perfect target. Emma's condition worsened 2 weeks later. She woke up in the middle of the night with a fever and a rattling cough that sounded like broken glass. Jack drove her to the emergency room at 3 a.m, his hands white on the steering wheel, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The doctors admitted her. They ran tests. They came back with faces that Jack had learned to read like a road map. The surgery couldn't wait any longer. They had scheduled it for 6 weeks out, but Emma's heart was weakening faster than they had predicted. They needed to operate in 10 days, or the risk of permanent damage would become too high. Jack sat in the same plastic chair he had sat in 100 times before. He listened to the numbers. The surgery would cost $230,000, not including the hospital stay, not including the follow-up care. The hospital would not proceed without a deposit of $50,000. Jack had $312 in his checking account. He had a credit card with a limit of $2,000, already maxed out from Emma's medications. He had a truck that was worth maybe $4,000 if he sold it for parts. He had nothing else. He called Marcus from the hospital parking lot. It was 2 a.m. Marcus answered on the third ring, groggy but alert. Jack told him about the surgery. He told him about the $50,000. He didn't ask for a miracle. He just asked if there was any way to speed up the case. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that made Jack's blood run cold. He said the club had filed a motion to dismiss the case the day before, and the hearing was scheduled for the same morning as Emma's surgery. Jack would have to be in court at 9 a.m. The surgery was scheduled for 7. He couldn't be in 2 places at once. He couldn't afford to miss the hearing, because if the case was dismissed, the club would never pay a cent. He couldn't afford to miss the surgery, because Emma would be alone. She would wake up from anesthesia with no one there to hold her hand. Jack hung up the phone. He put his head against the steering wheel. He didn't pray. He had stopped praying after Sarah died, because praying had felt like shouting into a void that didn't care. But he sat there in the dark, with the hospital lights reflecting off the hood of his truck, and he made a promise to himself. He would find a way. He didn't know how, but he would find a way. The next morning, Jack did something he had never done before. He went to the club manager's office and asked for a meeting with the board of directors. The manager, a weasel-faced man named Reynolds, laughed at him. He said the board didn't meet with janitors. He said Jack should go back to his mop and forget about the lawsuit. Jack didn't argue. He walked out of the office and went to the members' parking lot. He found Veronica Ashby Hughes's car, a black Mercedes Maybach that cost more than Jack's entire apartment building. He waited. He waited for an hour and a half. When Veronica came out of the clubhouse with her friends, Jack stepped in front of her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten her. He simply told her that his 7-year-old daughter needed heart surgery in 10 days, and that the club owed his family money that would pay for it. He asked her to help him. Veronica looked at him the way you look at a panhandler who has interrupted your lunch. She said, and she said it loud enough for her friends to hear, "I don't care about your daughter. I care about my property values." Then she got into her Maybach and drove away. Jack stood in the parking lot for a long time. He watched the taillights of her car disappear around the corner. He felt something inside him shift. It wasn't anger. It was something colder and more dangerous. It was the understanding that some people would never see him as human, no matter how much he bled. And that understanding gave him a strange kind of freedom. He didn't have to be nice anymore. He didn't have to be invisible. He went back to his truck and drove to the library, and he spent the rest of the day researching Veronica Ashby Hughes. He found articles about her late husband's company, a tech firm called Apex Solutions that had gone public in the 90s and made the family hundreds of millions. He found property records for her mansion in the hills outside Austin, a 12,000 square foot estate with a swimming pool shaped like a kidney bean. He found her charitable foundation, which donated money to art museums and opera houses, but never to hospitals or children's charities. He found something else, buried in the minutes of a zoning board meeting from 3 years earlier. Veronica had tried to buy the land adjacent to the club, a small parcel that belonged to an elderly widow named Margaret O'Brien. When Margaret refused to sell, Veronica had used her influence to have Margaret's property rezoned for commercial use, which dropped its value by 60%. Margaret had been forced to sell. She had moved into a nursing home and died 6 months later. Jack printed out the zoning board minutes. He printed out the property records. He printed out everything he could find. Then he called Marcus and told him he wanted to file a countersuit against Veronica personally for harassment and abuse of process. Marcus hesitated. He said it was a long shot. He said Jack would need evidence that Veronica had personally directed the club's legal strategy. Jack said he had a feeling. Marcus said feelings weren't evidence. Jack hung up and went back to work. The next 7 days were the longest of Jack's life. He worked his shifts at the club, mopping the same floors, emptying the same trash cans, while the members walked past him without seeing him. He spent every other hour at the hospital, sitting beside Emma's bed, reading her stories about brave princesses and dragons who turned out to be lonely. He held her hand while the monitors beeped and the nurses came and went. He didn't tell her about the lawsuit. He didn't tell her about Veronica. He told her that everything was going to be okay, even though he didn't believe it. On the 8th day, Marcus called with news. The club had offered a settlement, $20,000, cash, in exchange for Jack dropping the case and signing a non-disclosure agreement. $20,000 was less than half of what Jack needed for the surgery deposit. It was an insult. It was also the only money anyone had offered him in 3 years. Jack sat on a bench outside the hospital and looked at the sky. It was a clear blue Texas sky, the kind that made you believe in infinite things. He thought about Sarah. He thought about what she would have said. She would have told him to fight. She would have told him that $20,000 was a bribe, not a settlement. She would have told him that Emma deserved better than a father who gave up. He called Marcus back and said no. He said he would see them in court. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, okay. He said he would be there with Jack, no matter what. The morning of Emma's surgery, Jack woke up at 4 a.m. He showered. He put on the only suit he owned, a gray polyester thing he had bought at Goodwill for $12. He drove to the hospital. Emma was already awake, sitting up in her bed, her hair in 2 braids that a night nurse had made for her. She smiled when Jack walked in. She said, "Daddy, I'm not scared." He said he wasn't scared either. They both knew he was lying. The nurses came at 6:30. They gave Emma a sedative. She held Jack's hand as the medicine took effect. Her grip loosened. Her eyes fluttered closed. Jack kissed her forehead. He whispered that he would be back before she woke up. Then he walked out of the room and drove to the courthouse. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. in a small courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Travis County Civil Courthouse. Jack arrived at 8:45. Marcus was already there, standing outside the courtroom, holding a thick stack of papers. He looked younger than his 24 years. He looked nervous. He told Jack that the club had hired a new lawyer, a former federal prosecutor named Allison Drake, who had a reputation for shredding opponents in summary judgment hearings. Jack nodded. He didn't have anything to say. He walked into the courtroom and sat down at the defense table. The room was small, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry bees. A few rows of benches stood behind a brass rail. Veronica Ashby Hughes sat in the front row, flanked by her lawyers and a publicist who was typing on her phone. Veronica was wearing a cream-colored dress and sunglasses that she kept on even though they were indoors. She did not look at Jack. The judge, a woman in her 50s with a sharp face and tired eyes, entered at 9 on the dot. Her name was Judge Loretta Baines. She had a reputation for being fair but impatient. She called the case. Allison Drake stood up and argued that Jack's claim was frivolous, that the 1952 deed clause had been invalidated by a subsequent transfer of ownership, and that Jack had no standing to sue because he was not the direct heir of the original seller. She spoke for 20 minutes without notes, citing case law and statutes with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Marcus stood up next. He was shaking, but his voice was steady. He argued that the clause was still valid under Texas property law, that Jack was the last surviving descendant of the original seller, and that the club had failed to make a single payment in 68 years, which constituted a breach of contract. He held up the deed. He held up the copies of the county records. He pointed to the red-inked clause and read it aloud. Judge Baines listened without expression. She asked a few questions. Then she said she would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 30 days. Allison Drake smiled. Veronica Ashby Hughes took off her sunglasses and smiled too. 30 days meant Emma's surgery would be long over. 30 days meant Jack would have to find $50,000 somewhere else or watch his daughter's heart fail. Jack stood up. He opened his mouth to say something, but Marcus put a hand on his arm and shook his head. The hearing was over. They had lost. Jack walked out of the courthouse into the bright Texas sun. He didn't go back to the hospital right away. He walked to a park 3 blocks away and sat on a bench under a live oak tree. He put his head in his hands. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the last time he had seen her smile, a real smile, not the brave one she wore in the hospital. It had been a month before the diagnosis. They had been sitting on their front porch, watching Emma ride her bike in the driveway. Sarah had leaned her head on Jack's shoulder and said, "We're lucky, you know." He hadn't understood then. He understood now. He was lucky to have had her at all, even for a little while. He was lucky to have Emma, even if the universe seemed determined to take her away. He sat on that bench for an hour. Then he stood up and walked back to his truck. He drove to the hospital. Emma was still in surgery. The waiting room was full of other families, other parents with the same hollowed-out eyes. Jack found an empty chair in the corner and sat down. He waited. He didn't pray, but he hoped. He hoped harder than he had ever hoped for anything. At 2 in the afternoon, the surgeon came out. He was a tall man with gray hair and steady hands. He told Jack that the surgery had been a success. Emma's heart was stable. She would need time to recover, but she was going to live. Jack fell to his knees in the middle of the waiting room. He didn't care who saw him. He cried. He cried for Sarah, for Emma, for the 3 years of scrubbing toilets and eating peanut butter sandwiches and pretending he wasn't breaking. He cried until a nurse helped him to his feet and led him to Emma's room. Emma was still asleep, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that looked normal for the first time in years. Jack pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down. He took her hand. He didn't let go. 2 weeks later, Jack received a letter in the mail. It was from the law firm that had represented the club. The letter said that the club's board of directors had voted to settle the case for an undisclosed sum, and that Jack would receive a check within 30 days. The letter did not explain the sudden change of heart. Jack called Marcus. Marcus sounded stunned. He said the settlement was for $750,000 plus legal fees. He said he had no idea what had prompted the offer, but that Jack should take it and run. Jack didn't run. He drove to the club. He walked into the manager's office without knocking. Reynolds was there, along with 2 members of the board. They looked at Jack like they had seen a ghost. Jack asked why they had settled. Reynolds stammered something about avoiding litigation costs. Jack didn't believe him. He asked again. The board members exchanged glances. Finally, one of them, an old man with a red bow tie, spoke. He said that Veronica Ashby Hughes had been removed from the board the previous week. He said that the other members had discovered something about her, something that had changed their minds. Jack leaned forward. The old man hesitated, then told him the truth. Veronica had been stealing from the club for years. She had been funneling money from the club's operating budget into shell companies she controlled, using the same methods she had used to force Margaret O'Brien off her land. When Jack's lawsuit threatened to expose the club's finances, Veronica had panicked. She had tried to bury the case, but her own lawyers had turned on her when they realized she was hiding evidence. The club had conducted an internal audit. They had found millions missing. Veronica had been forced to resign from the board and sell her membership. She was now under investigation by the IRS. Jack sat back in his chair. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he stood up and walked out of the office. He didn't feel satisfied. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired. But he also felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt hope. The settlement money arrived 6 weeks later. Jack paid Emma's medical bills. He paid off the credit card. He bought a small house on the edge of Austin, a 2-bedroom with a backyard and a pecan tree, just like the one he had lost. He didn't buy a new truck. He didn't buy a suit that wasn't from Goodwill. He put the rest of the money into a trust for Emma's future. And he went back to work. Not at the club. He had quit the day after the settlement, walking out of the locker room for the last time without looking back. He started a small handyman business, fixing leaky faucets and patching drywall for people who couldn't afford a real contractor. He charged what they could pay. He worked when Emma was in school. He spent his evenings reading her stories and tucking her into bed. He was not rich. He was not famous. But he was free. And freedom, he learned, was worth more than all the diamonds in Veronica Ashby-Hughes's jewelry box. One afternoon, 6 months after the surgery, Jack took Emma to the park where he had sat on the bench and cried. Emma was stronger now. She could run without getting winded. She could climb the jungle gym without turning blue. She sat on the swing and kicked her legs, and Jack pushed her higher and higher until she laughed the way Sarah used to laugh, a big, open laugh that made everyone around her smile. A woman walked past them on the path. She was wearing a faded sundress and pushing a stroller. She stopped when she saw Emma. She said, "She's beautiful." Jack said, "Thank you." The woman introduced herself as Claire. She said she had moved to Austin a few months ago after a divorce. She said she was looking for someone to fix the fence in her backyard. Jack said he could do that. They talked for 20 minutes while Emma played in a sandbox. Claire laughed at Jack's jokes. She touched his arm when he made her laugh. Jack felt something stir in his chest, something he had buried with Sarah. He didn't know if it was courage or foolishness. He didn't care. He gave Claire his number. She called him that night. They went for coffee the next day. And for the first time in a very long time, Jack Morrison let himself imagine a future that didn't hurt. The moral of the story is simple, but it's not the kind of simple you find on a greeting card. It's the kind of simple you learn in the dark, when you're on your knees in a bathroom scrubbing a floor that someone else will walk on without a thank you. The world is full of people like Veronica Ashby-Hughes, people who see others as obstacles or tools or inconveniences. They have money and power, and the confidence that comes from never having been truly hungry. They will try to break you. They will try to make you believe that you are nothing. But they are wrong. You are not nothing. You are the father who holds his daughter's hand in the hospital. You are the mother who works 2 jobs to put food on the table. You are the janitor, the cashier, the bus driver, the person who keeps showing up even when showing up feels like drowning. And one day, if you keep showing up, the universe might just show up for you. Not because you deserve it, but because you never stopped trying. Jack Morrison didn't win because he was smarter or stronger or luckier than anyone else. He won because he refused to stop fighting for the only thing that mattered: his daughter. And in the end, that was enough. That was always enough.